It's 2 a.m. You have work in 6 hours, and you're lying in bed replaying a sentence you said at lunch, wondering whether the person across from you took it the wrong way. You've already run 3 versions of how they probably interpreted it. You've drafted a casual follow-up text in your head. You've abandoned it. You've considered whether this says something about you as a person. Nothing happened. There's no crisis. And yet your brain is treating this like a problem that must be solved before you're allowed to sleep. You know the feeling. Most people do. But almost no one understands what's actually happening when it does. This is not a weakness question. It is not a confession of failure. It is, in fact, one of the most quietly universal experiences of the human mind, a kind of cognitive weather that visits nearly every person who has ever cared deeply about something, feared something, or simply paid attention to the world around them. And yet we almost always experience it in isolation, as if it were uniquely our own burden, as if everyone else has somehow found the off switch we were never given. We call it overthinking, but that word undersells it, because this isn't just thinking too much. It's something more specific, the mind turning back on itself. Thought examining thought. A loop where the more you try to conclude, the more material your brain generates to analyze. You don't just think about the problem. You start thinking about your thinking. And that second layer is where it gets difficult to stop. To understand why this happens, it helps to consider a fundamental aspect of how the human mind is built. The brain is not, at its core, a machine designed for peace. It is a machine designed for anticipation. For hundreds of thousands of years, the most dangerous thing a human being could do was to be caught off guard. The predator you didn't see coming, the member of the tribe whose intentions you misread, the winter you failed to prepare for. These were the errors that ended everything. And so the mind evolved a remarkable capacity, the ability to simulate futures before they arrived, to run internal rehearsals, to map out threats and responses in the theater of imagination before any of them became real. This is where things start to change, because what was once a survival mechanism has, in the architecture of modern life, become something far more complicated. The threats we face today are rarely the kind that can be solved by faster simulation. They are ambiguous. They are social. They are existential in nature, questions about meaning, identity, belonging, adequacy. And yet the mind brings the same ancient tool to bear on them. Simulate, analyze, rehearse, repeat. The loop begins not because something is wrong with you, but because something very old inside you is trying very hard to help. Psychologists describe 2 basic modes in which the brain operates. One is fast and automatic, the kind of thinking that's already finished before you notice it started. The other is slow and deliberate, the kind you can actually feel happening. Overthinking sits at the border. It starts as a conscious attempt to work through something real, but gradually, the loop takes over. At a certain point, you're no longer choosing to think about it. It's running on its own, and you're just watching it go. And this is where the story becomes more complicated, because one of the most counterintuitive things about overthinking is that it is often most intense not in people who think carelessly, but in people who think deeply. People who hold themselves to high standards. People who are acutely aware of consequences. People who have, somewhere along the way, learned that it is dangerous to be wrong. For them, the mind's attempt to eliminate uncertainty through more analysis only generates new uncertainty, new angles, new possibilities, new interpretations, and the territory to be mapped expands faster than any map can be drawn. Imagine a library that responds to every question you ask it by producing not an answer, but 10 new books. Each of those books raises 5 new questions. Each of those questions summons its own shelf. The library is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. But the reader standing in the middle of it is no closer to the door, and the room keeps growing. The psychological cost of this process is not only fatigue. It is something more precise, a gradual erosion of the sense that action is possible at all. When every option has been examined from enough angles, when every potential outcome has been given sufficient weight, the mind begins to lose its capacity to distinguish between what matters and what merely feels urgent. Decision becomes paralysis. Reflection becomes rumination. And the person who began by trying to think clearly ends up further from clarity than when they started. But here's what's worth paying attention to. When you strip away the specific content, the replayed conversation, the imagined worst-case outcome, the decision you've revisited a dozen times. What's left underneath isn't really a thought. It's a feeling. Specifically, the feeling that something is unresolved, and that it isn't safe to leave it that way. Psychologists call this intolerance of uncertainty, and it turns out to be one of the most reliable drivers of ruminative thinking. The loop doesn't keep running because there are too many options. It keeps running because the mind cannot tolerate the state of not knowing, and so it keeps searching, even when there's nothing left to find. This distinction matters enormously, because if the problem were simply too much information or too many options, the solution would be simple: reduce information, reduce options. But if the problem is a learned conviction that uncertainty is inherently dangerous and must be resolved before life can safely continue, then the loop will sustain itself regardless of how much has been resolved, simply by generating new uncertainties to take the place of old ones. The mind is not searching for an answer. It is avoiding a feeling. What looks, from the outside, like indecision or anxiety or even intellectual excess, is more precisely understood as a form of emotional self-protection. The overthinker is not weak. They are, in a particular sense, extraordinarily vigilant. A person whose nervous system has concluded, through experience, that the world rewards preparation and punishes surprise. The loop is not a character flaw. It is a learned architecture built over time in response to a world that once required it. Knowing this doesn't stop the loop, but it changes what you make of it. There's a meaningful difference between having a thought spiral and believing you're someone who can't think clearly. One is a temporary process. The other is a story about who you are. And that story, once accepted, tends to produce exactly the evidence it needs to keep itself alive. Think of a craftsman so reliant on one tool that he reaches for it, even when the job calls for something different. The tool isn't faulty. His skill isn't in question. But the wrong instrument, applied to the wrong problem, produces the wrong result, no matter how expertly it's used. The overthinking mind is doing something similar. It's applying analysis to problems that analysis was never designed to solve. The ancient Stoics had a phrase, amor fati, a love of fate, a willingness to embrace what cannot be controlled. They were not, as is sometimes assumed, advocating passivity. They were advocating a particular cognitive discipline, the ability to distinguish between what lies within one's influence and what does not, and to direct the mind's energy only toward the former. The overthinking mind, by contrast, makes no such distinction. It treats everything as potentially within reach of sufficient thought and suffers for that generosity. And so we return, finally, to that quiet room, to the exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body, to the question underneath the question, why can't you stop? The answer, arrived at slowly and without fanfare, is this: because some part of you still believes that thinking harder is the same as being safer. That clarity can be extracted from repetition. If you revisit the thought one more time, arrange it from one more angle, you will finally arrive at the certainty you need to breathe. What no amount of further thought can provide, however, is the one thing the loop is actually seeking. Not an answer, but permission. Permission to be uncertain. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to step forward without the guarantee that stepping forward will not cost you something. That permission does not come from thought. It never did. It comes from the quieter, slower work of learning to sit with what cannot be known and discovering, gradually, that you have survived it before. Share project content anime canal NW created by you add PDFs, documents, or other text to reference in this project.